Welcome all to Bahá'í Chat, a conversation series dedicated to our interconnectedness. It's an uplifting moment when we can turn our thoughts to spiritual ideas. Each session is rooted in the Baha'i writings and the fundamental teachings of the oneness of God, the oneness of religion, and the oneness of mankind, led by individuals putting these principles into action. We have no clergy in the Baha'i faith, and one of our most fundamental teachings is independent investigation of truth. If you aren't already in contact with the Baha'i and would like a bit of virtual one-on-one accompaniment to begin such an investigation, where you can ask questions, be guided to material that would especially resonate for you, or be introduced to Baha'is and community building activities in your area, we invite you to connect with our Baha'i Guide program. You'll get a personal invitation to connect in whatever virtual way you'd like at a time that works for you. For more details, simply send us an email at info@baha'i.chat. That's in the chat box right now, that link, and write guide in the subject line. Baha'is believe that we are living in the great day of God, foretold by each of his messengers, the revealers of the major world religions. All of these divine educators are connected. Their messages are progressive, ever leading mankind forward to new levels of unity. Each has been the bearer of a preordained message, essential for the times. God's latest manifestation and founder of the Baha'i faith is Baha'u'llah. That is an Arabic title meaning the glory of God. Baha'u'llah appeared in Iran in the middle of the 19th century, bringing during a turbulent 40-year ministry in which he suffered torture, repeated imprisonment, 4 successive exiles, when some 20,000 of the faith's early believers were put to death during a single decade, an unprecedented volume of teachings. His revelation writings in the form of thousands of prayers and tablets comprise over 100 volumes, much of which has already been translated into 800 languages. His overarching and most essential mission is nothing less than the unification of the entire human race, a reality promised in the scriptures associated with each of God's former messengers. In the words of Jesus Christ, for example, as recorded in the Lord's Prayer, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." The Universal House of Justice, an institution called for in the writings of Baha'u'llah and established some 70 years after his passing, invested by him with the robe of infallibility, designed to assure the ongoing cohesiveness and indivisibility of the worldwide Baha'i community, protecting it thereby from division and schism, is elected every 5 years by the membership of some 200 national spiritual assemblies worldwide. In an October 1985 letter written by the Universal House of Justice and directed to the peoples of the world, this uplifting vision of mankind's ultimate destiny is shared. To the peoples of the world, they write, the great peace toward which people of goodwill throughout the centuries have inclined their hearts, of which seers and poets for countless generations have expressed their vision, and for which from age to age, the sacred scriptures of mankind have constantly held the promise, is now at long last within the reach of the nations. For the first time in history, it is possible for everyone to view the entire planet with all of its myriad diversified people in one perspective. World peace is not only possible, but inevitable. It is the next stage in the evolution of this planet, in the words of one great thinker, the planetization of mankind. The letter continues, though, with this clear warning. Whether peace is to be reached only after unimaginable horrors precipitated by humanity's stubborn clinging to old patterns of behavior, or is to be embraced now by an act of consultative will, is the choice before all who inhabit the earth. While mankind's ultimate destiny is nothing less than brilliant, the loving warning of the collective pain that we continue to bring upon ourselves on our journey to get there seems more and more applicable with every passing year. We'll be talking today about one of the most monumental challenges on this path to our ultimate collective destiny. Writing to the American Baha'i community in 1938, Shoghi Effendi, the guardian of the Baha'i faith, referred to it as America's most vital and challenging issue. It is the urgent need to root out every trace of systemic racism and anti-Blackness that has pervaded American society now for some 400 years. Our distinguished panel, Dr. Payam Akhavan, Dr. Hoda Mahmoudi, and Dr. Rashawn Ray, will be led by one of Baha'i Chat's favorite moderators, Dr. Layli Maparyan. Layli is the Catherine Stone Kaufman 67 Executive Director of the Wellesley Center for Women and Professor and Chair of Africana Studies at Wellesley College. She's best known for her scholarship in the area of womanism and is the author of two groundbreaking texts in the field of womanist studies, The Womanist Reader, 2006, and The Womanist Idea, 2012. She's also published significantly in the areas of adolescent development, social identities, including biracial, bi-ethnic identity, and the intersections of racial, ethnic, sexual, spiritual, religious, and gender identities, Black LGBTQ studies, hip hop studies, and history of psychology. Layli, it's good to have you back. Welcome to the chat.
Thank you, David. It's always a pleasure to be part of Baha'i Chat, and what a great program we have today. I don't want to waste any time in getting right to the conversation, and I'd love to go ahead and introduce the eminent speakers that we have with us today. I'm going to start with Dr. Payam Akhavan. Payam Akhavan is a member of the Permanent Court of Arbitration and Professor of International Law at the University of Toronto with prior appointments at McGill, Yale, Oxford, and Paris. He was previously UN prosecutor at The Hague, served with the UN in Bosnia, Rwanda, Guatemala, and Cambodia, and appeared as counsel before the International Court of Justice on behalf of genocide survivors. He is co-founder of the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center and author of numerous publications, including his best-selling memoir, In Search of a Better World, A Human Rights Odyssey in 2017. Welcome, Payam. I'd also like to introduce Dr. Hoda Mahmoudi. Professor Hoda Mahmoudi has held the Baha'i Chair for World Peace at the University of Maryland, College Park since 2012. She studies structural racism and root causes of prejudice, equality of women as a prerequisite to peace, human nature, global governance, and globalization and the environment. Professor Mahmoudi collaborates with a wide range of scholars, researchers, and practitioners to advance interdisciplinary analysis and open discourse on global peace. Before joining the University of Maryland faculty, Professor Mahmoudi served as the coordinator of the research department at the Baha'i World Center in Haifa, Israel. Prior to that, Dr. Mahmoudi was Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at Northeastern Illinois University, where she was also a faculty member in the Department of Sociology. Professor Mahmoudi's books include A World Without War, Abdu'l-Baha and the Discourse for Global Peace, co-authored with Dr. Janet Kahn, Interdisciplinary Perspectives on Human Rights. Welcome, Hoda. And third, I'd like to introduce Dr. Rashawn Ray. Dr. Rashawn Ray, a David M. Rubenstein Fellow in Governance Studies at the Brookings Institution, is Professor of Sociology and Executive Director of the Lab for Applied Social Science Research, or LASSER, at the University of Maryland, College Park. He is also one of the co-editors of Context magazine, Sociology for the Public. Formerly, Ray was a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Health Policy Research Scholar at the University of California, Berkeley. Ray's research addresses the mechanisms that manufacture and maintain racial and social inequality with a particular focus on police-civilian relations and men's treatment of women. His work also speaks to ways that inequality may be attenuated through racial uplift activism and social policy. Ray has published over 50 books, articles, and book chapters, and nearly 20 op-eds. Welcome, Ray. I'm sorry, Dr. Ray Rashan. I should also note.
Fine.
Thank you. I should note that Dr. Mahmoudi and Dr. Ray were both mentioned in the recent feast letter from the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States in regard to their racial justice work at the University of Maryland. So it's really wonderful to have all three of you here. And I'd like to begin with a question that kind of connects the dots of today's topic. And I'd like to invite all of you to respond. Human rights is an organizing discourse for both social justice and human well-being, and it has achieved institutionalized status in entities such as the United Nations at the same time as it has continued to spawn diverse social movements around the globe. And yet, strangely, there has been something of a disconnect between US racism, including the movements to end it, and global human rights discourse. What do you think explains this disconnect? And I think I'll start with Payam.
Thank you, Professor Maparyan. It's an honor to be on this distinguished panel with dear friends and colleagues. And it is intriguing to see the disconnect between the civil rights and human rights movement in the United States and the global human rights movement. And there may be various reasons, one of which is that America is a superpower. It is such a large nation that it can, in many respects, afford to be more insulated from these global forces, perhaps than smaller nations. But we really have to situate, I believe, the struggle against racism in this wider historical context in order to understand better the synergy which exists with struggles within America and struggles throughout the world. And I would maybe just make three quick observations just to open the conversation. The first is we should never take for granted the basic premise of human equality. It has taken thousands of years of historical struggle, throughout which the enslavement and extermination of the weak by the powerful was casually accepted. So as much as we have very serious challenges ahead of us, as much as we have suffering and injustice that we must confront, there is also cause for tremendous hope and optimism in terms of where we are in our collective historical evolution. The second point is that the issue of racism and racialism, which itself is a big question. What do we really mean by racism? But I'm speaking here about the classical definition based on the notion of racial superiority or even biological racism has been essential to the emergence of the human rights movement. And there's a dialectical relationship between the unprecedented violence of the 20th century and the unprecedented ambitions that we have in universalizing human rights. And of course, the key moment was the Holocaust, which we forget was all about theories of Aryan racial superiority. But it was racism in the European theater at a time when much of the world was under colonial domination, and those colonial genocides are largely absent from our historical consciousness. Everyone will know about the Holocaust, but very few people will know, for example, about the fact that Belgian hyper-exploitation in the colony of the Congo basically wiped out an estimated 10 million people, or half of the population of the Congo between around 1880 and 1920. So colonial genocides, and of course the indigenous peoples of the Americas, and in fact, slavery in the Americas began with the Spanish conquistadors who enslaved indigenous peoples for extracting gold and silver, and African slavery was sort of a subsequent phase of that sort of colonial history. And I mention this because by the 1960s, the question of African colonial domination and anti-Black racism, if you like, had become the predominant force in the global human rights movement. And in fact, one of the defining moments was the Sharkville Massacre in South Africa, when a group of Black South Africans who were protesting outside a police station were massacred. And by 1965, the first human rights treaty, this is not the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted in 1948, but I'm talking about the first legally binding treaty adopted by the UN, was the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And it was very much in the crucible of apartheid in South Africa, which of course was the most blatant manifestation of institutional racism. And throughout the 1960s, about half of the population of the world gained their freedom and liberty in what is known as the process of decolonization. So I will maybe stop there and simply say that I think we need to explore much more how the movement against racism in America relates to these broader historical forces and what forms of collaboration there can be.
Thank you, Payam. I really appreciate the way you've broadened the question of racism and connected the dots across time and across the globe to help people get a broader view. Hoda, what would you add on this topic of the disconnect?
Layli, if you don't mind, may I defer to Rashawn?
Sure. Rashawn?
I definitely think Hoda was going to have some amazing things to say on this point. I'm honored to be here. I really look forward to this conversation. I mean, what Payam said was right on target. I mean, when I think about this, part of it is American exceptionalism. And that's essentially what we heard, is that America was founded with this genetic birth defect on the question of race and racism. But interestingly, the history is told a different story. Tried to paint it in a different light, at least until recently, or until things come to light and we have kind of these racial awakenings. I feel like we're in one of these moments now. I would say the last one was probably in the 1940s and 50s, but really the 60s when people really got on board in terms of thinking about that. So American exceptionalism oftentimes leads to people in the United States not paying as much attention to what's happening around the world. But some of that is purposeful. Part of that is because some of the uprisings and revolutions that we see in other parts of the world are purposefully not told and shown to people in America and vice versa. And part of thinking through that is we have to think about who writes and tells history and who discusses the news. What is newsworthy and noteworthy to show and display? And I think about that in the context of how much social media allows for people to see the actual experiences of people who might be in the Middle East, who might be in, say, Asia, who might be in Europe, and who might be in Africa in ways that we couldn't previously. So I think that's part of the reason, is that who writes and tells history and the news can oftentimes shape it in a particular way. I think the other big thing beyond American exceptionalism in the news is that we have a difficult time making the proper connections between American slavery and colonization around the world. And because of that, we make a disconnect and make it seem as if they're completely different types of processes at play, when really they are highly connected. I mean, we simply really have to look at the African continent to see the links between slavery in not just the United States, but in the Caribbean and also in South America and Central America, and the links to colonization, not just on the African continent, but of course, Europe coming into play, and even Asian countries playing a role as well in various ways. I would say the final thing is about language, that in the academic literature, scholars who say study racism in America compared to scholars who study human rights in what we would consider in the US context in a cross-comparative perspective, oftentimes are using a different language. So when that language becomes translated for the public to be scaled up, even from a policy perspective, the language being used is different. So people oftentimes don't make the connections, but we should make the connections, because whether or not we're talking about slavery or colonization or any other sort of caste system at play, it's about exploitation. They are about power, they are about wealth, and they are about control, oftentimes using race or the social construction of race, ethnicity, skin tone, some type of metric by which to justify the relegation of people. I mean, we heard a second ago about biological race and racism. Part of that was, for a very long time, biology and genetics were used as a way to justify the relegation of Black people, dark-skinned people around the world, and also, depending on which country you're in, people with darker skin tones in those particular countries, like in Brazil or certain countries in Asia and even in Africa. And what I always say when I teach my race classes at the University of Maryland is that the social construction of race, based on the falsification of the science of race, is oftentimes used to justify the exploitation of race for economic gains. And whether we're talking about colonization or American slavery, it comes back to power, wealth, and control.
All great points. And in fact, we think about not just who tells the history, but who does the science. Both are equally important because all of those can be quite biased endeavors and they typically serve the dominant interest. I also really appreciate the points you made connecting the US focus on the history of slavery and the more international focus on the history of colonization and decolonization. I'll never forget the first time that I went to an international social science conference in Africa, my first trip to Africa, and coming out of the Africana Studies department, still being so focused on the history of slavery, never hearing anyone mention that, and getting my first real download about colonization, and then coming back and putting those discourses together. It's really something that we need to elevate in the way we teach history related to race and racism in the United States. So let me now jump to another question. It's related, but a little different. The United Nations has played a unique role in calling out racism in the United States because its supranational scope and authority have necessarily placed the United States racism on a level playing field with other human rights abuses around the world. Various UN reports on US racism from 2009 to 2020 have pointed out the grave extent of race-based abuses and racial violence, as well as the culture of impunity in the United States for both state and non-state perpetrators of racially motivated violence and discrimination. How can the United States learn from other parts of the world about how to address racism? So it's a carryover from the previous question because we talked about the ways it's understood, but how has it been addressed elsewhere and what can the US learn? I'll let anybody jump in at first, so I'd love to hear from all of you.
May I jump in on that one, Layli?
Please do, please do.
Again, I want to follow up with what has been already said, and that is the history of racism in the US. The problem that I see, and I see this even in the courses I teach, is that often the history of the US in terms of racism and slavery is not well articulated in every arena where we, not only in the educational sector, but as Dr. Ray said, in media. And I think one of the issues is, and I'm going to use an example from the author Macpherson. He wrote a book about the American Civil War, and he talks about freedom of or freedom from and freedom for. And he mentions how the Union Army was fighting for freedom from bondage for women and men, and the Confederate Army was fighting for a freedom to do as it wishes. I think this freedom from and freedom of is very much at play today in the American society. In fact, I think it has even become more evident since recent events, especially the one at the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. This division is still very much a part of this country. And so when you ask what can America learn from other countries, it can learn a lot from what other countries have engaged in. And I think Payam can elaborate on that in terms of truth and reconciliation efforts and other efforts that are ongoing. But the problem is that when there is no will in America to learn from other models, then I think we have a problem. And unfortunately, again, when a nation has enough power to ignore these things, then it's very difficult to try to address them at their root. And I think the history of this country is something that is very much still alive in the current contemporary society of America.
Mm-hmm. And I appreciate what you said about the will to make the change and to talk about the issues differently. It makes me think, particularly as a developmental psychologist, when and where is will for such things manufactured or stimulated, and how can we influence that? And I know that's sort of a tangent, but it's a question I'd like people to be thinking about while we're talking about this, because there are ways to make change. And we have to really show up in those places and in those ways to increase the will that you're talking about. Payam or Rashawn, would either of you like to add to this question about what we can learn from other parts of the world about how to address racism?
Perhaps I can just interject briefly. First of all, I go back to what Rashawn said about American exceptionalism. And in a sense, exceptionalism comes from the position of superpower supremacy. So you can afford to be a exceptionalist. But I think that there is a lot that international law can teach us about how the American legal system can improve. And generally speaking, the American legal system is resistant to a more cosmopolitan view of international law and other legal systems. So, for example, the 1965 Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination has far-reaching obligations, imposes far-reaching obligations on states to take active measures against incitement to racial discrimination. And I think in the kind of, I would say sometimes excessively laissez-faire kind of individualistic culture in North America, we forget, for example, that there are boundaries to freedom of speech, that in fact incitement to discrimination and hatred are a violation of human rights. They have nothing to do with free speech. And I mention this because one of the other lessons that we have to learn is how easily incitement, given the right ingredients, can escalate into catastrophic violence. And perhaps in recent years, we've been, shocked out of our complacent slumber. And to realize that what happens in other countries can also happen in North America. And I've seen through my years with United Nations how in situations of chaos, turmoil, widespread anger and alienation, demagogical populist leaders can fan the flames of hatred as a deliberate instrument of power. And there's a difference between impulsive hatred and deliberate systematic instrumentalization of hatred. So I think we cannot be complacent that we are somehow exempt from those same forces which have resulted in massive violence in other countries. So we need to inoculate ourselves and take very seriously the issue of racism and incitement. If I may just say a couple of other quick points. One other aspect of human rights which is very important, and it goes to what Rashawn said about structures of exploitation, sort of the racialization of social inequality. And of course, colonialism, slavery, were inherently and sort of inextricably connected with relationships of wealth and power, as Rashawn said. So beyond racism as a kind of social construct, it served very specific purposes, and it still does when we speak about mass incarceration and what have you. So I mention this because when we talk about human rights, what do we think about? Civil and political rights, freedom of expression, freedom of speech. We have this very individualistic idea. Human rights is about protecting our individual autonomy. But international law tells us that economic and social rights are also part of human rights. The right to adequate healthcare, the right to education, the right to a living wage, and so on and so forth. And I think that until we tackle those issues of our sort of culture of consumerism and materialism and social inequality and indifference towards the gross accumulation of wealth, we will also suffer in our struggle against racism, because racism is related also to questions of social inequality. And it's famously said that if you feed a hungry man, they will call you a saint. But if you ask why he's hungry, they will call you a communist. And I'm astonished at how, if I may say with the greatest respect, certain quarters have brainwashed people in America to think that if you talk about universal health care, you're a communist. That is one of the most absurd lies, which of course is about maintaining structures of privilege, which would be an understatement. It's a system of obscene greed and gross accumulation of wealth, while millions of people suffer from poverty amidst plenty. So we need to also think about, well, what is this thing we call human rights? What is this thing we call equality? It's not just about the absence of racism, but it's also about the affirmative obligation to have some element of social solidarity. And I will just end on one small note, getting back to lessons learned. I mean, there are so many lessons to be learned from so many societies that have gone through this process of what Professor Mahmoudi called healing and reconciliation. And I think about two examples. One is the example of Nelson Mandela. People forget that South Africa was on the brink of civil war. And was it not because of the visionary leadership of someone like Nelson Mandela, who after 27 years of imprisonment, brutal imprisonment, merely because of the color of his skin, came out of that prison, and the first thing he talked about was forgiveness. And that was not his weakness, that was his strength. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Africa was absolutely phenomenal. What can we learn from that? In Canada, we had, if I talk about our race problem in Canada, is more about our Indigenous brothers and sisters. And in Canada also, we had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which addressed the colonial legacy of thousands of Indigenous children who were forced away from their families and communities and sent to the so-called residential schools, where they were to be, if you like, civilized. And the profound trauma of those sort of forced separations of children still explains the horrific conditions of Indigenous communities in Canada. And that Truth and Reconciliation Commission perhaps is inspiration. Maybe there could be a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in America, where thousands of people come and they tell their stories of suffering and injustice, because racism is an abstraction. It means everything and nothing. But when you hear stories about what it means in a visceral, intimate, daily sense, then I think a lot more people begin to relate to it, not as some kind of ideological posturing, but as a basic question of human empathy.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point. Go ahead, Rashawn.
I mean, these are excellent points. I mean, very important points. I mean, when I think about what we can learn, I mean, it really is around truth and reconciliation. And part of thinking about reconciliation is about restitution. That is a debt that is owed, that must be repaid. And if we think about it literally and figuratively, we're specifically talking about reparations. And I think for the United States, on one hand, it's a truth and reconciliation process. On the other hand, it is paying a debt for the legacy that still makes a difference in our lives currently, that legacy being about slavery. In 1860, Black people's bodies in the United States, Black people who were enslaved, their bodies were worth $3 billion, just their bodies. We haven't even gotten to the products they produced. We haven't gotten to what they were creating. Their physical bodies were worth more money than the railroads and factories put together. One thing we know is that the United States, whenever we get to a point to really truly engage in a truth and reconciliation and reparations process, we fall short of that. If we go to the end of the Civil War, what we had was a field order to provide formerly enslaved Black people with 40 acres and a mule. That's where that comes from. Well, President Lincoln was assassinated. That deal went off the table. It wasn't simply about slavery, though. We fast forward and we had during the Great Depression and New Deal policies on the heels of World War II, where Americans and the Allied forces were going to ensure that people who were Jewish, who were captive in Germany, that they will be able to get out of that, while simultaneously keeping Black people in bondage in Jim Crow segregation in the United States. So one thing we know is that the United States is actually capable of this. We know this around Japanese internment. We know this around American Indians in the US, around land and compensation. And even though those things fall short or inadequate, they have occurred. So when we look internationally, there are definitely some models here. Obviously, the South African model is one of the best around how we think about truth and reconciliation. And part of this is important for a couple of broader ideological reasons. The first is that the United States is a very young country, relatively speaking. Compared to other countries around the world, the United States is very, very young. So there's still a lot that is being done to kind of solidify what the United States is. The second thing is part of what happens in the United States, and I also think in a lot of other places around the world, but since these countries are older, they have a longer history by which to draw upon to know this isn't true. But one of the assumptions is that racial progress is linear, meaning that if we just let time keep going on and we do nothing, that racism is going to dwindle and racial equity is going to improve. And that's definitely not the case. And if what happened at the US Capitol last month didn't tell us that, I'm unsure how people will be able to get to that point. There are a couple other things I think we can learn. I think we can also learn from the international context around accountability and hate crime laws. There are some countries that have very strong hate crime laws. In the United States, they are woefully inadequate. I mean, just inadequate. I mean, you cannot hold hardly anyone accountable for a hate crime. Now, as Dr. Mahmoudi knows, in the state of Maryland, we've had our own case, even at the University of Maryland, of the murder of Lieutenant Richard W. Collins III. And Hoda and I are also on a reparations committee at the University of Maryland doing a lot of this work. And so hate crimes are being strengthened. The Lieutenant Richard Collins law in the state of Maryland can become a national model. Let me quickly be specific about it. A lot of our hate crime laws, the way they read, they say that a person had to commit an act solely because of a protected clause, race or gender, religion, or what have you. Well, as we know about from attitudinal literature, hardly no one makes a decision based on one thing. They make a decision based on multiple things. But if a person is making a decision based on race or racism, then that's considered hate, right? If they're making that decision based on someone's religious background, oftentimes that is because of hate. So the Lieutenant Collins law now says that if a person commits a crime in partly due to one of these protected clauses, it will be considered a hate crime. I think that is really forward thinking and where America needs to go. The other thing we know is that part of thinking about history in the US, and Ida B. Wells said this best, is that people who do the murders are oftentimes the ones writing the reports. And so this goes back to what you were saying about science. Like, who are the scientists? Who are the reporters? Who are the people giving us this history? If we look in the United States, and I ask my students this, I ask them to name me 5 white people who have really fought for racial justice. They can't do it. But there are several examples. But our history does not provide white people with those examples. And I think we're starting to get some of those more recently, but we haven't had a lot of them. Final 2 things I'll say is that racism in America, and I also think that racism around the world, oftentimes changes shape, right? It changes shape in the sense that after we feel as though we've dealt with one part, then it morphs into something else. It really becomes like the same candy wrapped in a different wrapper. Like you think you're getting a new piece of candy and you open it up and it's the same candy. It's the same thing that we've been dealing with over and over again. And I think that's part of what happens with racism. And that's part of the reason why our policies are delayed. For example, one big way we're starting to see racism play out now is through technology. And the laws and the policies we have in place are so far behind that they can't even keep up with it. And I also think, and both of the other panelists spoke to this very, very important point, that there's an assumption in America about meritocracy, about the so-called Protestant work ethic, that if people pull themselves up from their bootstraps, they're going to be successful. And that could be farther from the truth. We know, even if we look at not only slavery and who benefited, it wasn't just white slave owners, it was white people writ large. If we look at the Homestead Act, it was white people writ large who were able to claim land that was supposed to be for free to Black people. When we look at New Deal policies in the GI Bill, it was white people who were given a leg up while Black people had those same chairs to sit in swiped from underneath them. So we have to be very clear that in America, part of American exceptionalism is supposedly this meritocracy. When people get to talking about universal health care, when people get to talking about some sort of education equity or guaranteed income that people have been talking about for decades, there's an assumption that that's communist talk or that that's socialist talk, when really, in fact, we've always done that in America. We've just primarily done it for white people.
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, it raises the question of when are we going to embrace well-being and justice for everyone? This is sort of alluding to my next question, which begins to draw from some of the Baha'i guidance. A recent letter from the Universal House of Justice, which actually came out last year, as David mentioned, the supreme governing body of the global Baha'i community, stated that, quote, racism is a profound deviation from the standard of true morality. It deprives a portion of humanity the opportunity to cultivate and express the full range of their capability and to live a meaningful and flourishing life while blighting the progress of the rest of humankind, unquote. I'd love to hear each of you comment on this statement from your own particular perspective. And maybe I'll start with you, Hoda, because I know that you all have been doing some work on this at the University of Maryland.
You know, I love that statement because this notion of true morality, you know, at the Bahá'í Chair, and Dr. Ray knows about this, one of the things that we focus on, you know, is the moral framework. It's the ethics of these issues. And we always ask the speakers that we invite to consider giving us solutions that address this problem of racism at that moral level. And I think this is really where the most important work has to take place. I'm thinking about the future generations of children that we raise. And how do we instill in them, you know, the notion of the fact that every human being deserves human dignity? You know, this is so important. I think that actually human dignity foreshadows human rights. It has to be first. And so this moral reality, that it goes against true moral reality, you can't, you know, human beings are not, how can I say, there's something indivisible, irreducible about a human life, about every human being. And I'm interested in systems of knowledge that actually address this at a very fundamental level and actually begin to instill in generation after generation the spiritual responsibility, if I may put it that way, the spiritual responsibility that we have to each other. And I think shy of that, I really don't have solid solutions. Laws are important. I would never deny that. Laws are extremely important, but we keep passing laws and we see what happens afterwards. So for me, it's this idea of human dignity, of human, the value that each human being brings to the world, and how to create systems, institutions that then allow every human being to have the capacity, the freedom, and the will to offer their own talents and capacities to the rest of society. And unless we reach that level, I'm not very hopeful about just passing laws.
But what you say is very important in terms of thinking about our conceptions of human nature, you know, because they drive everything else. So if we have assumptions about human nature being individualistic and competitive and violent, unless it's, you know, restrained in some way, then we're going to build a world around that, versus if we can somehow transform our understanding about human nature to something more collaborative, more collective, et cetera, then it puts us on a different platform. Other thoughts about this idea of racism as a profound deviation from the standard of true morality?
If I may just share a few thoughts, what Dr. Mahmoudi has said has inspired many thoughts. I mean, one is the basic premise that all that it takes for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. So we sometimes speak about morality as an abstraction, as a kind of code of conduct. But morality is about our responsibility to act. It's about accepting our agency. And the reason why small groups of white supremacists or neo-Nazis, or in other contexts around the world, I could give you the exact equivalent in the ethnic cleansing in the former Yugoslavia, the genocide in Rwanda. In every instance, there are small, determined, hateful minorities, which basically hijack the masses and take them down the road to hell. So the first point is accepting our responsibility. The second point is I as a law professor, accept entirely what Dr. Mahmoudi says. Laws are not enough. Laws actually are only effective where they're sustained by social and cultural forces. Otherwise, the laws are on the books, but then in our daily lives, we still perpetuate all of these injustices. But this is very encouraging because it shows us that culture is a profound arena of resistance and transformation. And in my view, the only lasting true revolutionary changes come from seismic shifts in grassroots consciousness. I think we put far too much hope in our political leaders and elites, who of course have a role to play, but what we do in our own lives, our own communities and places of work and family relations, that is how you really bring about profound generational shifts which transform social relations. I also wanted to just reflect on one last point, getting back to this excerpt from the Universal House of Justice, saying that racism not only victimizes its sort of, it doesn't only have victims or sort of the object of that hatred or discrimination, but it blights all of humankind. And of course, one thing that comes to mind is that we deprive ourselves of the contributions of this particular group in society, which is marginalized and oppressed. But I think there's a deeper message there. And it reminds me of a famous saying of James Baldwin, who said that hatred is not about the inferiority of the victim, it's about the inhumanity of the perpetrator. And I'm paraphrasing. But I say this because Jean-Paul Sartre also famously said about anti-Semitism that the Jew exists in the mind of the anti-Semite. If the Jew did not exist, the anti-Semite would invent him. So I would say the same thing, that this hateful construction of the person of color or what have you exists first and foremost in the mind of the perpetrator. It has nothing to do with the reality of the victim. It's about the needs of the perpetrator to hate. And in that sense, it is a denial not just of the humanity of the victim, but also of the humanity of the perpetrator. So we have to begin to change the conversation, just as we do in our discussions about equality between men and women. We realize that sort of toxic masculinity is also a form of self-harm for men. It's not just women who are going to suffer from such sort of toxic identities. And I think that this may be the kind of emancipatory discourse that we need to have in the context of healing and reconciliation and rehumanization as an antidote to dehumanization. When people begin to realize how truly ugly and despicable it is to hate others, not least for the color of their skin, the most absurd distinction imaginable, the most random distinction imaginable, then I think we can create an enlightened generation which instinctively steers away from the populist sort of hatred and other currents which perpetuate these injustices, because people realize that they are only undermining their own dignity. Going back to what Dr. Mahmoudi said, it's not just the dignity of the victim, but also the dignity of the perpetrator.
Rashawn, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just chime in on a couple of points. I mean, I think that all of this is great. I mean, when I think about that quote, what really stands out to me is the juxtaposition in the way that it was able to really draw out how one group of people are able to fully embrace a range of potential possibilities, while another group of people literally have, as I mentioned before, has the chair knocked from under them. See, when we talk about racism, and we just heard this, and I want to double down on it because it's such an important point. It's not simply about one group losing out. Like it's not really about that. It's about one group having less opportunity and another group getting more opportunity, oftentimes for doing the same thing, while all of a sudden being convinced that they are achieving solely because they are working hard and that they are better. Doesn't mean that they didn't work hard. It's the fact that they have also been convinced that they are there because solely because of those reasons, while simultaneously getting into the psyche of the relegated group and the marginalized group to convince them the exact opposite. This is why concepts like stereotype threat are so profound, that you have minority groups, particularly Black people and even women in certain contexts, like in math, for example, taking a test when they are primed about their race or gender, they perform worse. I mean, look, Jane Elliott was one of the first people that really highlighted that in A Class Divided in showing how easy it is to convince people of doing these particular things. So it's, but here goes the point. Everything that I've described up to this point is very micro level. It's in people's minds. There's a structural element at play that oftentimes we cannot see because we are experiencing it. And part of that structural element is oftentimes what lives on. I think about it in two ways. First, one of my colleagues at Brookings, Andre Perry, he has a saying where he says, there's nothing wrong with Black people that ending racism won't solve. Like, I think it's just such an amazing statement, because what happens is that we continuously look for, oh, well, if Black people did this and Black people did that, you know, if Turks in Germany did this, if this group did that, no matter which country we're in, without looking at the source of the river that caused it, which is systemic racism and how it plays out. Hoda and I have a book that that will be coming out hopefully this year, if I ever get back to it and finally finish the parts that I'm supposed to finish. But it's all about systemic racism. And really what it is highlighting the work that the Bahá'í Chair for World Peace at the University of Maryland has been doing for years on this topic. I mean, look, a lot of people are new to this. Hoda's been doing this for years, having the best scholars come to have these conversations, to think deeply about this. And a theme throughout all of these speakers and all of these writings is not only, on one hand, thinking about systemic racism, but also thinking about how one thing we're not explicitly saying and talking about is whiteness. That everything that we're describing is that whiteness gives certain types of benefits and perks that other people don't have. And, President Lyndon Johnson said this best during the Civil Rights Movement. He said, if you can convince the lowest white man, and he was talking about social class when he says low and high, he said, if you can convince the lowest white man that he's better than the best Black man, you can pick his pocket and he won't even know that you're doing it. And his point is that if we would join together in terms of helping to deal with poverty, helping to deal with human rights and civil rights, and realize that oftentimes, whether you're talking about a poor rural white farmer in the South or the Midwest, and then also a Black person living in urban America, that they oftentimes have some similarities there, that race mutes out. And the reason why race mutes it out is because what President Johnson was talking about, and what this quote really illuminates, is that whiteness is not only about social class. See, for too long, we framed power and prestige in the terms of social class. It's not solely about that. It's also about cultural, social, and symbolic capital and power that people are able to take advantage of. So that low and high is about the fact that you can have a Black physician who is one of the top surgeons in the country and even the world. But when he or she goes to a restaurant, when he or she goes to the gym, when he or she goes for a run, they are viewed as simply another Black person engaging in that act. And hence, the criminalization and weaponization that we put onto their bodies becomes justified. Comparatively, a low-income white person could go to those same places and be treated like they are the best person, really just treated morally, treated the way people should be treated. And so part of what happens is that this is part of the reason why a large part of Trump's base include low-income rural white people. Not all, because there are definitely a lot of examples of affluent, highly educated white people who also support him. I think that's a misnomer to completely classify it that way. But oftentimes the reason why they support Trump is because they realize that whiteness and white supremacy as an ideology is at the root of how we think about systemic racism and interpersonal racism. And part of what that means is if that ends, not only do they have to compete in a different way economically, but now they have to compete for social and cultural and symbolic capital. And that's part of what they're not willing to give up.
You know what? That's a powerful place for us to pause and bring David back in. I think you all feel like I feel we're just getting going on these topics, and we're going to have a chance to come back in a few minutes, but I just want to turn it over to David for a few minutes.
This has just been such a rich conversation. Really a privilege to have each of our panelists today, Drs. Ray, Mahmoudi, and Akhavan, and also our moderator, Dr. Maparyan. But for those who might need to sign off, we do this. Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you'll stick around. We have just a few announcements, and then we'll take a brief 3-minute intermission and jump into the Q&A. Which, again, if you haven't already been in contact with a Baha'i and would like a bit of virtual one-on-one accompaniment to get started in your independent investigation of the faith, we invite you to connect with our Baha'i Guide program. We're putting a link in the chat right now, an email address that you can just write to us about. We have some wonderful programs coming up. Our next program, 2 weeks from today, on February 27th, Navigating the Double Epoch, Thoughts on Changing Humanity's Current Plotline, will be based on Hugh Locke's essay by the same title, available in a 5-part series published at Bahá'íTeachings.org. We're posting that link in the chat box as well. Hugh will be joined for that presentation by Hoda Mahmoudi. We're so fortunate to have her coming back, and distinguished environmental thought leader and author Arthur Dahl. The essay sets out the case for viewing the great global crises of our time as the result of a failure to accept the oneness of humanity as a core organizing principle. The essay weaves together the Baha'i writings with both scientific and historical references in order to argue for giving a name to this unique, unprecedented period in human evolution. We're also delighted that Payam Akhavan will be returning, first on April 24th, where he'll be joined by Bonnie Dougal, the principal representative of the Baha'i international community to the United Nations. Then again on May 8th, he'll be back together with film production team that will be releasing its groundbreaking feature documentary based on Payam's best-selling autobiography, In Search of a Better World, A Human Rights Odyssey. We're also very excited to be launching this month on February 28th, a monthly last Sunday of each month new program, Baha'i Chat with Rainn Wilson. American actor, comedian, writer, director, producer, and human rights advocate. Rainn is best known for his hilarious role as Dwight Schrute on the NBC sitcom The Office, for which he earned 3 consecutive Emmy Award nominations. He will join us monthly for light, 1-hour-long conversations on various aspects of the Baha'i faith, and that hour will include a question and answer period as well. You can get more details about these and other programs, access all of our previously edited Baha'i Chat sessions, and sign up to stay in the loop by receiving our regular newsletter.
Welcome back, everybody, to the question and answer portion of Baha'i Chat. We'll get started with a few questions to our panelists once they're back in the room, and then we will start taking some of the questions that you have put into the question and answer box. There's still time to add questions for those of you who might be interested in doing so. And in fact, I've been reading through them during the break, and I see a number of overlaps between the types of things that people are asking about. So we'll get to as many of them as we can. But I want to start with a question that I know David actually wanted to ask. And it actually encompasses some of the questions that people have put forth in the Q&A, and that's this. What needs to happen in order for America to to move toward a real and fundamental healing with regard to racism? I know that's a very broad question, but this is sort of the chance for you to give your dream solution. So let's start with you, Dr. Ray.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fundamentally about truth and reconciliation and reparations. And I know we've said a lot about that, but I'll scale it up to tell people how close I think we might actually be. So I mentioned the work that we've been doing at the University of Maryland on this issue, but even at the state of Maryland and at the federal level, I'm on a task force, if you will, with Congresswoman Barbara Lee and Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. Barbara Lee heads up a truth and reconciliation bill that she put together following the murder of George Floyd. Senator Cory Booker has signed on to that bill. Before he was the signer, Vice President Harris, then Senator Harris, was working on that bill. Simultaneously, there is a reparations bill that's actually been around since 1989 that was originally created by Congressman, the late John Conyers, that is now being headed up by Sheila Jackson Lee, who is a Congresswoman from Texas. That legislation came on the heels of reparations for Japanese Americans who were interned. And I want people to think about this timeline in the American context, that they were interned illegally during World War II. Reparations were not given until 1988. So oftentimes the questions that people ask about, well, can we do anything about the past? What can we do? Of course, like we do it all the time. And last time I checked, there's no statute of limitation on murder. Last time I checked, there were Black people being murdered, whether that be lynched, even after slavery, about every 40 hours in the United States, which, mind you, corresponds to the number of people who are killed, the number of Black people who are killed in the United States today, that every 40 hours a Black person is killed by a police officer in the United States. We can't necessarily disconnect these things, nor can we disconnect the fact that law enforcement in the US was founded as slave patrols, which were patrols sent out to capture Black people who had fled a plantation for their freedom, which was more than people might actually think. So I say that to say the reparations bill, which is HR 40, and then the Truth and Reconciliation Bill, which is HCON Resolution 100, already pretty much has the number of votes those bills need in the House of Representatives. With the Senate being set up the way it is and VP Harris controlling the tiebreaker, based on what happens with COVID, I could see something happening this year or next year that could be big on that. Now, of course, it goes down to implementation and things like that. But in the US, there are other examples. We can go to education. Georgetown has went through this process. Princeton has went through this process. Now, the state of Virginia, I want people to think about this, the state of Virginia, which when we start talking about racism and whiteness in America, I mean, the history of that country, the history of that state in terms of playing a role in this is huge. They just passed earlier this week legislation saying that their universities have to address reparations and how Black people being sold or working on their university helped to create their endowments, just like Georgetown and Princeton did. Cities like Asheville, North Carolina, and Evanston, Illinois currently have reparations bills that they've passed. And then the state of California passed a Truth and Reconciliation Bill, which was headed up by Dr. Shirley Weber, who's an academic, by the way, and turned politician. I say this to say, there's a lot of momentum right now. We're in this moment. And part of what happened at the Capitol is that anytime massive racial progress is being made, civil rights movement, after the Civil War, there's always a huge backlash. And part of what we have to do is to continue to be prepared for this backlash. I think Trump was part of that as a response to former President Barack Obama. But if it wasn't Trump, it would have been someone else. And so part of thinking through this is, I think that is one of the main processes we have to go through. The United States of America has to deal with the legacy of slavery and its current remnants. I mentioned how much Black people were worth in 1860. Today, Black people have 10 times less wealth than white people in the United States. That's not based on hard work or even whether or not people went to college or not. For example, the racial gap in wealth for people who went to college is 7-to-1. White college graduates have 7 times more wealth than Black college graduates. We can link it directly back to slavery and also New Deal policies and even discrimination in housing, redlining, and some things like that. So look, I doubled down on reparations. it has to be done in the US context for us to get past this. We cannot piecemeal it, because one thing we know is that whenever policies are piecemealed, and even whenever policies are put in place, like take affirmative action. Affirmative action was originally put in place to address race, right? Like President Kennedy said, I'm taking affirmative action to ensure that Black contractors can get the contracts that they deserve when it comes to government lending and contract work. Well, we fast forward, and affirmative action has been effective in various ways, but primarily effective at dealing with gender inequality, particularly in education and work. That's really, really important. Like it's desperately needed. And there's still a lot of work to do when it comes to gender inequality, particularly around the wage gap. But it's important to note that affirmative action was originally put in place to address race, and it's failed in a lot of regards in that respect. So if we're going to do this, it has to be transformative. It can't simply be another reform of policy, as Hoda was saying. I mean, policy has always failed. But I think a bigger question, of course, is on the truth and reconciliation front. It's not only what the policy looks like, but also how we address people's hearts and minds.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Hoda, would you like to follow up on that in terms of what you envision, what needs to happen in order for America to move forward in terms of real and fundamental healing and healing with regard to racism?
Well, I can only speak for myself, but I know, and I'm going to speak from my own religious beliefs now. I'm going to make this personal because that's the only way I can respond. We are told as Baha'is that we are to remove distinction, any form of distinction between human beings. And we are also told that no matter where we live, because it changes from country to country, we have to be cognizant, aware, and educated about the minorities within our setting, no matter where we live in the world. So as a person who has those values, those spiritual values, and lives in the United States, it's very clear. I have a responsibility to know about the minorities in this country, and more importantly, to do the kinds of things that I can do in the circle that I'm in, and I work at a university. So who do I hire? What kind of classes do I teach? Who are my colleagues and friends? What ways can I help the institution to bring about more diversity, equity, inclusivity? For me, it really boils down to how each of us as individuals has a role to play and take responsibility for making sure that there is equity, inclusivity, fairness, and justice. And this is not, we all know this is not easy work, but at some point it means that I might have to step aside. At some point it means I may have to accept less so that someone else who has not had the opportunity has a chance. So to me, it's really at that level that change will come about. I see the power struggles in this country. I see as we speak, what's happening in the political realm. Eventually that system, I think, if it continues in the toxic form that it is in currently, it's going to reach a level where it'll be intolerable for the whole country. It will impact and tarnish the reputation of this country. But we individuals don't have to necessarily be a part of the hatred and the ugliness of the systems that surround us. We need to bring something different to this. And for me, as I said, I'm a white person, and I have to take the responsibility that is given to me, the spiritual responsibility, to make sure that systemic racism of all forms are eradicated in this country. And sometimes by doing that, people question your motives. People may even send you hate mail. People may do other ugly things, but that's what it's going to take. If this is what we believe in, if we believe that we need to eradicate racism from our midst.
Mm-hmm. Payam, what would you add to that?
Well, I I'm certainly not an expert on the American context, but I want to just reflect on something that Dr. Ray said about backlash, or what some have called whitelash. And I think it goes back to the social and political construction of identity based on exclusion and subordination of others. And the discussion we had earlier about how it's more about the perpetrator's needs than the reality of the victim. So I think that privilege, whether it's white privilege, male privilege, and it could be many different things in different contexts. The point is that when your identity is based on the domination of others, then their call for justice and equality becomes a visceral threat to your sense of self. And I think we need to understand that dynamic. Why is it, as Dr. Ray appropriately said, that whenever there's significant movement forward in respect of equality, civil rights, then there is this countervailing force? And one idea which I think we should explore is the cataclysm of infantile regression, as I like to call it. And I've seen this in so many different ethnic, racial conflicts around the world when I used to work with the United Nations, when in the midst of change, and change, of course, is not only inevitable, but we live in a period of exponential change in the world. And that change isn't just about globalization of the economy and mass migration and climate change and all of those things, but it's a visceral redefinition of what it means to be a human being, what it means to belong to this greater thing called humanity, the planetization of humankind, as the French philosopher Desjardins famously said. So, and maybe I could just share one small story in comparative perspective. I want to look at racism in France, here in Europe. And in 1998, when the football as in soccer World Cup was in France, the final was between France and Brazil. And of course, the French team was mainly either Arabs, Moroccans, Algerians, from the former French colonies, or there were French of African descent from Caribbean countries and what have you. And the National Front, which was the racist party in France, was saying that this is not a real French team. This is a colonial team. Look at all these people of color. How can you even call this a French team? And it was really funny because instead of like this right-wing soccer hooligans, who usually are the ones that support soccer teams, all of the people that favored multiculturalism and inclusivity started siding with the French national team. And when they beat Brazil 3-0, even the racists had to celebrate because it was a great moment for the French Republic to have defeated Brazil in the World Cup. And it may seem like a kind of silly anecdote, but it really says something about how ordinary people process these issues. This became an issue of national identity. What does it mean to be French? Can Zidane, who was the soccer star, who's from Algeria, be a Frenchman? And of course, in that same year, the most famous singer in France was Youssou N'Dour, who's from Senegal, and eating Moroccan couscous in a restaurant in Paris was just as much of a French thing to do as having, cheese and red wine or what have you. So I think that we're going through this period of extraordinary change, where our sense of identity is being transformed at a remarkable pace. And if I want to say, it's the hissy fit of the identity warriors, I like to call it. And it's exactly that. It's the hissy fit, the temper tantrum of a frightened child. And we need to see it as just that. It is utterly futile and it will totally be defeated. And all of those that want to go back to an imagined past of a pure identity, which never existed anyways, are going to be relegated to the trash heap of history. So I think we should take seriously this kind of backlash, obviously, but we should also be confident that the tide of history is inside of us, on the side of those that embrace the oneness of humankind.
You know, you're making me want to pull out another passage from the Baha'i guidance that comes from that same letter from the National Spiritual Assembly, where they said the elimination of racism will require a sustained and concerted effort. It is one thing to protest against particular forms of injustice. It is a far more profound challenge to create a new framework for justice. And I feel like each of you in your own way is alluding to that concept of a new framework for justice. And I'm wondering whether we want to go further in building that out, because what I'm hearing is that not only do we need to make key policy changes, such as the ones that you were talking about, Rashawn, but also we need to do that heart and mind work, or that soul work that gets at the other levels of how we move in the world and the other levels of how we understand our identities. Because if we're going to think about ourselves, as you spoke of, Hoda, as, you know, sort of eliminating various forms of difference, we're obviously not talking about cultural differences, things of that nature, but understanding our spiritual reality and how that knits us together, how that makes us a one fabric, and what new potentialities that opens up for human civilization. So I'm wondering if all of you could talk a little bit about, you know, how do we need to transform the framework for justice and to make that sustained work possible? Because ultimately we have to bring everyone in. We have to bring in the cosmopolitan multicultural people, and we've got to bring in the people that in the present moment might be inclined to the backlash or the whitelash, but ultimately we're all one and we've got to come together somehow. So what transformations are going to make that possible? And I know that speaks to a few of the questions that are also in the Q&A.
I'll say a few things. I think first, I really like how you put that about the various stakeholders is essentially what we're talking about. There are a variety of stakeholders. Mm-hmm. Like being in the policy space, one thing that I found interesting is that we have a reductionist history. Once again, like we paint this portrait, like even if we go back to, say, the civil rights movement and even the end of slavery, those actions that led to the most progress were actually executive orders. Mm-hmm. There were tons of people who didn't support any of that. Like they didn't want any of that to happen, right? So what I've learned from that is sometimes we don't need all the various stakeholders. We just need enough of them. Right? We just need to tip the balance. And I think we're there right now. Like the most people came out to vote ever in American history. And then simultaneously, we got to be clear that the loser in this, Donald Trump, got the second most votes ever. We're in an extremely polarized country, just like America was in the 1960s, just like America was in the 1860s. We don't need everybody to support it, right? We just need to have enough. When I think about what it looks like to pursue this, I think about it in one main way, and then I'll tell what I think it looks like. It's new language that we've been using that really started with Angela Davis, but historian Ibram Kendi has really pushed it, which is about what it means to be anti-racist. We can't be colorblind. Like we don't live in a colorblind society. Like that's just not how it happens. And one thing my grandfather taught me, who served in 2 wars, as a drill sergeant, Purple Heart Bronze Star, he said, your silence is your acceptance, right? So we can't be colorblind and act like it's not going on. Instead, it's a typology that I've advanced that starts with what it means to implement a sociologically inclusive racial equity framework. And I've actually spoken about this at a Bahá'í Chair event a few years ago, where I really started talking about and articulating something that Melanie Hobson has talked about, which means what it means to be color brave rather than color blind. Part of this is a 3-step process. I'll make it quick. First is to be what's called a racial equity learner. That's part of what's happening now. All of us are learning. We're learning about things that we didn't previously know. So that's important. Okay, what do you do after you learn it? Like now you're not ignorant anymore. And also I think that a lot of racists actually aren't ignorant. I think calling them ignorant is an insult to them. It's also an insult to the power of white supremacy. Like they're not ignorant. A child is, 5, 10-year-old, maybe even a 15-year-old. 20, 25, 30-year-old, they know exactly what they're doing. They know exactly the benefits of whiteness that they're benefiting from. So racial equity learners first. Second is to be what I call a racial equity advocate. The way I think about this, it's like being an accomplice. It is speaking up for people who are oftentimes unable to speak up for themselves. Hoda's probably heard me say this. When it's really started hitting me was when I lived in Europe. And I would sit at a table with Europeans who were mostly German, because we were in Germany at the time. And they would talk about Turkish people. Like just say things like, oh, you went to that side of town, or, you got to watch out for people like them, or, when they do. And I remember walking back with my wife, going back to our flats, and I said, I think that's how white people talk about Black people in America. But since I'm Black, I'm never sitting at those tables when they do it, right? And I said, it's up to us to speak up when we're sitting at those tables, because our tables are highly segregated by race and class. So we have to be an advocate. The third thing is then we have to start being a racial equity broker. Part of being a broker is that you broker anti-racist behavior and accountability. Part of what that means is you have to fully interrogate the social institutions that you're in, whether that be work, whether that be your church or house of worship, your own neighborhood, everywhere you go, you have to interrogate it. Part of what that means is you do an investigation of the rules, policies, regulations, and laws that are in place. And anything that does not fully embrace anti-racism, then you have to disrupt those. What that means is to do an assessment of them and recreate them. It means we have to oftentimes deprogram ourselves to reprogram anti-racism. And that's a long and torrid process that I do think America is on, but we have to be careful to keep the foot on the pedal, because once we let up, progress does stall and oftentimes reverse. But I think that typology is really useful in advancing anti-racism.
That is, in fact, very helpful. Payam, what do you think?
Well, just a couple of points following Dr. Ray's very thoughtful remarks. The first is his discussion about polarization and the recent American elections and all of that. I think obviously that it's very easy to identify, racism, bigotry, which is overt, and to condemn it. And I think, most sensible, reasonable people will see it for what it is and they will condemn it. What I'm concerned about is the subterfuge of progressive platitudes, which creates the illusion of progress and genuine engagement, but which masks the fact that we're actually not willing to meaningfully engage in dealing with those iniquities. So at least when you're dealing with sort of a racist, bigoted discourse, you see it for what it is. It's staring at you in the face. But when you have political, intellectual, economic elites that pay lip service to platitudes, then that's a way of neutralizing you, to say that, look, we're so progressive, there's nothing wrong. And sometimes that is more harmful than dealing with a racist and a bigot. So, and I mention it because we live in a superficial, narcissistic culture of greed and consumerism, where even our idea of human rights activism is best described as slacktivism. It's the Facebook like, it's the virtue signaling, as opposed to rolling up our sleeves and saying, I am going to go and stare at injustice in the face. I'm going to go and feel what it means to be a victim of injustice. Which brings me to the second point, which is this thing we call empathy. And one of the issues that we need to confront are the limits, the potential and limits of political activism and what we mean by political activism. So certainly elections matter, certainly being involved in the political process, although it has profound flaws, which is a discussion for another time. But I want to go back to what I said earlier about culture as resistance and grassroots transformation, which maybe doesn't bring about quick results. And we live in a culture of instant gratification, unless during our summer internship, we haven't rooted out all racism in America. We're going to go and become disappointed and become cynical. Well, it's easy to be cynical. And you have to understand these are historical struggles. And very often, those who lay the seeds and sacrifice their lives won't even see the fruits. It may be future generations that will see it. So we need to understand that spirituality isn't just about some sort of self-indulgent, escapism, but it is fundamentally about connecting with the dignity and reality and humanity of the other. And that is what motivates us to act, not platitudes and politically correct slogans or whatever. It's when we connect in a profound way with the humanity of the other and we make their injustice our own. And that's very difficult to achieve in a culture which celebrates superficiality. We know from a profound spiritual perspective that without pain, we can never grow, we can never transform. And that is a sort of not a comfortable thing to realize in our consumer culture, because who wants pain? We want pleasure. We want mindless, instant entertainment. That's what our culture has become about. So that's where I think we need to understand that spirituality is actually the most profound form of radicalism. It's radicalism because it penetrates deeply within our own sense of self, who we are, what is the purpose of our life, what do we stand for, and what price are we willing to pay. And I'm just going to end my comment with just one small poem. I have to because I'm Persian and Persians have to tell poems. But there's a beautiful poem which is in the United Nations, and it's a 13th century poem from Saadi, who's one of the Persian mystics, whose words I think speak to us today. He says, "Human beings are members of a whole, created in essence of one soul. Should fate bring on one part pain, the other parts uneasy will remain." But this last part is what I really appreciate. He says, "You who have no sympathy for human pain, the name of human you cannot retain. So to have empathy is to be human. To be indifferent is to be inhuman." And we need to understand that at a profound spiritual level, if we are going to bring about meaningful change, beyond saying racism is a bad thing. Well, thank you very much. I think we figured that out. We need to go far more deeply and understand what it demands of each and every one of us.
Thank you for sharing that. I actually like that poem a lot. I've heard it before. I want to shift slightly. I think we're keeping the same thread, but I'm wanting to pull in some of these different quotes from Baha'i Guidance, just because of the nature of this program. The next one that I want to share is from the same National Spiritual Assembly letter that says, "Religion, an enduring source of insight concerning human purpose and action, has a key role to play in this process." That's one thing that we might do that's a little different in our conversation today, is really seriously talk about what role does religion play in the eradication of racism and the eradication of systemic racial injustice and violence, noting that religion has also, of course, been used to fuel the fire of those things, and having to distinguish different approaches to religion in the social change equation. But Hoda, I'd like to begin with you because you are the Baha'i Chair for World Peace and you're thinking about these issues night and day. So what do you think? Let's talk about how religion plays a role here.
Well, like you said, I think religion can, first of all, one religion made exceptions and created slavery, which went against everything that religion believes in. So religion can have a very negative influence when it becomes man-made, okay, when it's used for personal and group power. And I think one has to guard against that. One has to be aware of that. But religion can also be the source of great transformation. I think, since we're talking about race, Dr. Martin Luther King, he was a religious man. And when you look at his example in terms of, not only the books he wrote, the talks he gave, but his personal example, what he did in order to create this movement that ultimately brought about very, very important results in this country. that's the best of religion, because then you are taking the true nature of what I think is the role of religion in society, which is a change agent to bring about not only the cohesion or unity of the people, but also to create systems, to create institutions, communities that promote justice in every way possible. When religion degenerates and becomes either fanatical or, as I said, a group of powerful individuals begin to change it for their own benefit and personal gain, then I think we're in trouble. And I think it's extremely important for the individual to be very cognizant of this. And I'll stop there, but I could go on about the power of religion to transform. I mean, we've seen it throughout our history, the civilizations that emerged because of the birth of a new religion, whether Christian, Islam, Buddhist, and now I think the Baha'is believe that religion has this very positive role, but the challenge is to really live by what the religion teaches us to live by.
Rashawn or Payam, do you have thoughts about the role of religion?
Yeah, I mean, I'll quickly say I completely agree with what Hoda's saying. I mean, first, I've always been, I would say, taken aback and so overcome with joy in the way that the Baha'i faith approaches this particular issue. I don't know really any other religious faith, particularly across racial divides, class divides, various cultures, that approaches this in this way. And it's extremely admirable, because on most Sunday mornings in the United States, people walk into churches and houses of worship, and pretty much everyone looks like them, mostly by race. So as much as people supposedly talk about religious text and being inclusive, we don't see that. But when I go to Baha'i events, when I step in those places, I see what I think people ultimately want to see. And Dr. Mahmoudi mentioned MLK, and I think that's extremely important, because one of the things that he always talked about, he said, I'm disappointed essentially he was saying, I'm disappointed not in the racists that we know that exist, not in the white supremacists that we know that exist, but in the white moderate. And he was primarily talking about clergy, people who were his counterparts walking in faith. And we have to be clear in the United States and around the world that as much humanitarian efforts are done and human rights struggles that are engaged in abroad, there are a series of human rights violations that happen in the US context that's oftentimes perpetuated by people who are supposedly religious. And there is a sect, particularly among people who are white evangelicals, who are Protestant, there's a sect that morphs with politics and white supremacy that we really, really have to grapple with. And I think a lot of things can be done that can be dealt with that. I mean, look, it can start with changing Sunday morning. I mean, MLK also said the most segregated time in America is Sunday morning. I mean, that is blasphemous in the biggest way. And so it does oftentimes start with religion and what people believe about other people. And I continue to think that the Baha'i faith will continue to help lead some of these efforts in terms of highlighting what things should look like.
Yeah, and I appreciate you saying that, particularly as someone who isn't a Baha'i but has worked closely and in alliance with Baha'i efforts. It's very heartening to hear you speak of it that way. Payam, did you want to add anything about what religion contributes to our efforts for justice and ending racism?
Well, I think we need to think about what we mean when we use the word religion, and one could easily mistake religion and irreligion. And I think we need to look at substance rather than form. We have to remember, for example, that Christianity was used to justify colonialism. It was used to justify slavery. In South Africa, the church was instrumental in justifying racial segregation based on some idea that God intended for races not to mix. And so in a sense, religion, when one begins with the ego and selfishness, can be whatever we want it to be. But when we speak from the soul, if you like, from a deeper spiritual level, which goes back to what I was alluding to earlier, then religion can become a profound form of spiritual transcendence, rather than paying lip service to a set of empty dogmas and posturing to feel virtuous while turning a blind eye to iniquity. It becomes a personal transformation and responsibility and basis for a profound engagement, to the point where people will give their lives for what they believe in. And of course, as an Iranian Baha'i, I know this, that there are people who gave their lives to fight for the oneness of humanity. And I just want to end by saying one thing. In our modern or postmodern culture, obviously, there's a reason why the European Enlightenment happened. There's a reason why Christianity declined, because of the backwardness and dogma and superstition of the church of the medieval times. But we have to remember, and I think here about what Shoghi Effendi, the guardian of the Baha'i faith, said about substitute religions. What happened in the modern era is that we simply replaced religion with ideology. And colonialism and racialism was an ideology. So was fascism and National Socialism. So was Stalinism. So in a sense, however much violence religion has created, we look at the Catholic Protestant wars and the Crusades and whatever, modern ideologies have been far more violent and catastrophic. The tens of millions that have been slaughtered in the name of modern ideologies in the 19th and 20th century make the religious wars of the past pale in comparison. So in a sense, I would say there is no escaping the idea of religion, the idea of a worldview, the idea of some system of belief that makes sense of who we are as individuals, as collectivities, in this particular period of history. So perhaps we need to rediscover in the eyes of our postmodern cosmopolitan world, the meaning of religion, the meaning of spirituality has to be radically redefined. And Max Weber famously spoke about disenchantment as the price of progress. He said modern humankind has to stop irrational belief in the mystical world and use technology and science as the means of progress. And of course, the two world wars and the threat of nuclear self-destruction made us realize that science and technology, without a profound sort of moral anchor to keep us in check, will only perfect the means for self-destruction. So I would just end by saying that we need today a re-enchantment, but a re-enchantment not by going back to traditional identities and blindly imitating whatever ideas we have about our identity and our place in the world, but to move forward with courage in this unknown, highly turbulent, volatile world, and to reimagine the future. But we need that moral and spiritual anchor, what Dr. Mahmoudi referred to as dignity. What does dignity mean except this deep mystical self, which allows us to transcend our ego and to feel profoundly connected with others?
Thank you. And I might add to that, just as a personal note, that I think there's such tremendous power that we can draw from in the spiritual world, and that religion helps us gain access to that. There's something very literally powerful and helpful about connecting with the great beyond, you know. Okay, so we are in our real wrap-up moment. I'm going to give each of you 30 seconds to offer your final word to our guest today. I'm going to start with you, Hoda, then Payam, and then Rashawn. Please, this is your chance to say 30 seconds of your final word to everyone.
I would just simply say that I think we have enormous work ahead of us, and that what we need to really focus on is how to begin every day with a view to taking steps, doing whatever we can in our own place of life to eradicate racism, And I think it starts with how each of us actually reaches out to groups that are not like us, to find out about who they are, how they live, what their concerns are, and what are the most important issues in their lives. And certainly in this country, befriending and becoming familiar with the African Americans and the community and what they have to offer is profoundly important. But it really requires enormous action on our part. This is not the time to rest, to step back and take it easy. Much work to be done.
Thank you. Payam.
I will end on a note of hope to say that we don't choose to suffer, but people who have suffered can also demonstrate to us the astonishing light of the human spirit, our astonishing capacity for resilience. And I would say that there is a double burden, in a sense, on those who have suffered, not only to liberate themselves, but also to liberate those who may be indifferent and vexatious. So I think that I echo what has been said by everyone about assuming our responsibility to stand in solidarity with those who suffer, but we also should see tremendous hope in the capacity of people to go on demanding justice, because when you demand justice, then you see a glimpse of the resilience and power of the human spirit. And I'm confident that despite these backlashes, these sort of futile resistance, that the tide of history will move us towards oneness and the globalization of our identity.
Thank you, Rashawn.
First off, I just want to thank everyone for this event. This was amazing. This conversation was great and really important. And I think about it in the context, I don't know, call me a cautious optimistic. I don't know. But I tend to think that we're closer than we think. And that closeness could mean, maybe it won't even exactly mean our lifetime, but in the grand scheme of humanity, it's a long time. And the key question I think we should all leave with is, what are we doing to make a difference? What are we doing to better society? How are we becoming racial equity learners? How are we becoming racial equity advocates and brokers? What are we doing to racially diversify our dinner tables, to think about who's in our lives, to think about who we stand up for and what we don't tolerate in our lives? What are we doing? And one thing I know is, if we simply only do this work with the people who we love, everyone would have been touched throughout the world. And so sometimes centering love in the process can be the way toward racial equity.
I love that as a way to end. Optimistic and a call to action. Thank you so much to all of you. This has been a wonderful conversation, and thank you to our hundreds of guests who have been with us today. You know where to find us every second and fourth Saturday at 2:15 on Bahá'í Chat. So have a great rest of your weekend, everybody.